The first thing placed in your hand is not a shovel, a poker, or a bucket. It is the receiver of the butler's telephone. Somewhere beyond the house, at the Powerhouse, a man is waiting for a message. Upstairs, William Armstrong's family and their guests have moved into a different set of rooms. Those rooms now require electric light. The whole house cannot be illuminated at once, so someone must decide where the available current is to go, communicate that decision, and know whether the resulting light is behaving as it should. This is why you wouldn't survive winter in Lord Armstrong's smart home. You have entered Cragside, one of the most technologically advanced houses of its age, and before you can even make it safely through the evening, the house is asking a question you have never had to answer. Which rooms receive the electricity? Cragside's electric light was not a modern utility delivered invisibly and in unlimited quantity. Its historic generators and dynamos had limits. According to the National Trust's interpretation of the house, the butler, Andrew Crozier, used the estate telephone to ask the Powerhouse to direct electricity toward the rooms occupied by William and Margaret Armstrong and their guests. The request traveled out. The current was allocated in response. A lit room was therefore not simply the result of a person touching a switch. It was the end of a human sequence involving knowledge of the household, knowledge of the gear, and contact across the estate. If you enjoy evidence-led history that enters through the service door as well as the front, subscribe to Dynasty and Dust. The telephone beside you is not a decorative emblem of Victorian progress. It is a control link. If you do not know which rooms are occupied, you may request light where no one needs it. If you do know the rooms but cannot describe the requirement clearly, you have not solved the problem. If you assume that electricity is as abundant as it feels in a modern house, you have misunderstood the system before the night has properly begun. There is no evidence that a confused modern visitor was ever put in this position. That is our test, not a recovered event. But the operating limit itself is real, and it gives us a fair way to define who you are in this story. You are not a Victorian servant mocked for lacking modern knowledge. You are the opposite. You are a modern person without their practiced knowledge, asked to replace them at short notice. You can recognize a telephone. You can probably light a fire in some fashion. You may even understand the broad idea of hydroelectric power. None of that tells you how this particular house joins water, current, coal, hot water, food, signals, rooms, and people. The workers who kept Cragside running possessed routines that its architecture does not explain to a stranger. They knew what must happen next because they had learned the house as a working system. We are going to follow this winter house, one demand at a time, and the telephone has already exposed the central difficulty. Cragside is often described, with modern shorthand, as Britain's first smart home. The title also uses the name by which Armstrong became widely known after he was raised to the peerage, even though the house and its systems developed across years before and after that honor. Both forms of shorthand are useful only if we keep the history moving underneath them. Smart does not mean self-running. Lord Armstrong did not create a house that noticed every need, corrected every error, or protected an inexperienced operator. Its celebrated machinery could save labor, move energy, and make extraordinary comforts possible. It could not decide who needed the light. That judgment still belonged to people. So keep hold of the receiver. The evening has only begun. Electricity is one of the easier systems to notice because its effects are visible. Winter survival will also depend on heat that is not electric, coal that must travel through the building, water that begins far outside it, fires that demand repeated care, and machines whose apparent convenience rests on servants you cannot replace by knowing where the switch is. At Cragside, the most modern object in the pantry does not remove human duty. It carries duty from one person to another. The house stands in Northumberland, on ground that William and Margaret Armstrong began transforming in 1863. William would later become Baron Armstrong, giving us the Lord Armstrong named in the title, but Cragside's story cannot be reduced to one rank or one winter. What visitors see today was not conceived and completed as a single finished machine. It began as a relatively modest sporting lodge. Over roughly 3 decades, it grew through additions, experiments, altered routes, new rooms, and new technologies. That history matters because a large country house does not behave like a perfectly designed appliance. Each enlargement brings more space to warm, more distances to cross, more rooms to serve, and more points where an older setup may be asked to do a newer job. Northumberland also gives the winter test its proper setting, although it must be handled carefully. On 21 January 1881, the Met Office records a temperature of -23.3 degrees Celsius at Hayden Bridge. That reading was not taken at Cragside, and it cannot be silently moved to the estate. It tells us something narrower but still useful. Severe cold was possible in the region. We do not need to claim that this exact temperature reached the house. We only need to understand that winter in this landscape could turn warmth, water, fuel, and reliable movement from matters of comfort into matters of consequence. The growth of Cragside made those consequences harder to hide. A small lodge can concentrate its life around a limited number of fires and rooms. A mansion, assembled over time, presents a different problem. Corridors separate the people making demands from the people answering them. Upper floors make every load heavier. Service rooms and public rooms operate on different schedules. A guest may experience a warm bath, a turning roasting spit, a lit library, and a comfortable drawing room as 4 expressions of one effortless household. Below and beyond that experience, they are 4 different jobs, served by different machines and connected by staff. This is why the word winter cannot be treated as scenery. Snow on the rocks and frost on the trees would make an attractive picture, but the true pressure lies in repetition. The house has to be warmed again tomorrow. Water has to arrive again. Fuel has to reach the grate again. Light has to be directed toward the rooms people choose to occupy again. An experimental machine that works beautifully once is not yet a dependable household service. Dependability is the ability to produce the result night after night, while the family continues living as though the result were natural. By the time electric lighting became part of Cragside, the house had already begun as one thing and expanded into another. Its technology belonged to that changing structure. It was fitted into a living estate, tested, improved, and eventually supplemented as demand grew. This is the documentary story we will follow. Heat added in the 1870 expansion, indoor arc light in 1878, swan lamps in 1880, a manual switching explanation in 1881, troublesome lamps in 1884, and a generating setup nearer the house around 1886 as demand exposed the limits of what came before. That is a more interesting reality than the image of a mansion arriving fully formed from the mind of an inventor. It also makes your assignment less forgiving. You are not learning one machine, you are entering an accumulated environment whose present setup is the product of years of adaptation. The cold outside, then, is only the first boundary. The larger danger is scale. Cragside has become a great volume of stone, wood, pipe, water, wire, hearth, staircase, and expectation. Winter turns every one of those elements into part of the operating problem. The house may look still from the drive, but keeping it habitable requires movement almost everywhere you cannot see. Calling Cragside a smart home encourages one modern picture. We imagine a connected system with a common source of power, a collection of controls, and perhaps a reassuring central intelligence. The actual house is more revealing. Its comforts came from several systems that overlapped without becoming one. Water could provide power, but it also had to be stored and directed. Electricity could produce light, but it did not supply the house's winter heat. A basement boiler could warm pipes, but large fireplaces remained important room by room. A hydraulic lift could move coal upward, but the coal still had to be loaded, unloaded, and placed where a fire required it. A water-powered mill could turn the kitchen spit, but it could not judge the roast or manage the range. This changes the survival question. You are not looking for the single device that keeps the house alive. There is no master switch. There are inputs, routes, limits, and handoffs. Begin with light. Water power helped drive generating gear, and electricity had to be assigned according to need. Now separate heat from that story. Central heating was included in the first major expansion in 1870, years before the indoor arc lighting of 1878, and the Joseph Swan incandescent lamps placed in the library in 1880. The sequence alone warns us not to merge them. Cragside's electrical fame can make the house seem more unified than it was. The lamp and the radiator belong to different operating chains. Then add food. In the kitchen, a Barker's mill used water power to drive the roasting spit through shafts, gears, and cogs. That machine performed rotation. It did not bring food to the kitchen, prepare it, keep the range at the right heat, or decide when the meat was ready. Add movement. The hydraulic jigger lift rose about 9 meters and helped staff carry heavy coal and luggage to upper levels. It displaced some lifting through space. It did not abolish coal, stairs, servants, or the need to tend fires after delivery. Each design solved a portion of a problem. The house remained dependent on the portions that designs did not solve. That is the model to keep in mind as the winter closes around the estate. Water, light, heat, fuel, food, and service are not 6 isolated chapters. They cross. A demand in an occupied room becomes a message in the pantry. A need for warmth becomes a load in the lift, and then work at a grate. Water held in the landscape becomes motion in the kitchen, or power at generating gear. The public rooms display the result, while the service routes carry the causes. A modern visitor might be impressed by every machine separately and still fail to operate the house as a whole. Knowing that hydroelectricity exists does not tell you how current was rationed. Knowing that central heating exists does not tell you which fires still need care. Knowing that a lift carries coal does not tell you when, where, or in what quantity that coal is required. The dangerous gap is not general intelligence. It is local sequence. So the smart home label will remain, but with its concealed term restored. Cragside was smart because people made separate systems answer the household's changing needs. Remove those people, or replace them with someone who mistakes novelty for autonomy, and the intelligence disappears first. Electric light is so central to Cragside's reputation that it can distort the winter story. We associate electricity with almost every modern domestic comfort. A house wired for light feels as though it should be close to electric heat, electric cooking, electric water heating, and the familiar abundance of power that joins them. Cragside was not that house. Its heating history began along a different path. Central heating and the Turkish bath suite appeared in the first major expansion in 1870. Water-powered arc lighting entered the gallery in 1878. Joseph Swan incandescent lamps were installed in the library in 1880. The dates do not merely place designs on a timeline. They separate systems that modern memory tends to collapse. When electric light is limited, the consequence is darkness or reduced illumination in a room that might otherwise be used. When heat is limited, the consequence belongs to fireplaces, pipes, hot water, occupied spaces, and the accumulating cold of the building. The electrical allocation made by telephone does not direct warmth from room to room. A request to the powerhouse does not fill an empty coal scuttle. The skill of maintaining dynamos does not replace the skill of managing a grate. That distinction protects us from an easy but misleading failure story. If the lights went out, we cannot say that an electric furnace died with them. There was no such documented furnace in this system. If a room remained warm, we cannot conclude that the electricity was working. The house could experience success in one chain and trouble in another. The visible glow of a lamp tells you very little about the state of the fire, and the heat from the grate tells you nothing about available current. For a modern novice, this means that sensory evidence must be interpreted carefully. A bright room can still be growing cold. A dark service passage may be functioning exactly as intended because current has been directed toward guests. Warm pipes in one part of the house do not prove that every occupied bedroom fire has been attended. The house offers partial answers. You must know which question each answer belongs to. Cragside's electric fame therefore makes the job harder, not easier, if it encourages confidence in the wrong system. The word electricity promises modern unity. The house delivers Victorian plurality. Winter warmth continues to depend on heat made below the rooms, heat held in pipes, and heat maintained openly at fireplaces. That labor cannot be summoned through the butler's telephone. The first survival mistake was assuming that light waited behind a local switch. The second would be assuming that the power behind the light also defeated the cold. It did not. To understand warmth at Cragside, we must leave the generating system for the basement, then follow heat upward by an entirely different route. Central heating arrived at Cragside in the 1870 expansion, part of the same phase that created the Turkish bath suite. In the basement, a boiler heated pipes that ran beneath the floor of the bath. This was substantial domestic engineering. It moved heat away from an open flame and into a hidden route, allowing warmth to be delivered through the structure itself. Hidden heat is one of the great transformations of modern comfort. A person entering a warm room can forget that warmth is being produced somewhere else. The separation between source and sensation makes the service appear stable. At Cragside, however, the route did not abolish the source. Heat still had to be made at the boiler, transferred to the pipes, and maintained through gear whose state mattered. The evidence used for this episode does not securely identify the boiler's particular fuel. That boundary is worth keeping. Coal is documented as a heavy load moved through the house for fires, and fireplaces are visible throughout Cragside. It would be easy to let that fact answer every fuel question. It cannot. So we will not build a false scene of a named servant feeding a coal-fired boiler at a stated hour. The better story is the one the house actually permits: a basement heat source, warm pipes beneath the Turkish bath, and a system that creates luxury upstairs by concentrating the work below. To the person enjoying the bath, underfloor warmth may feel like a property of the room. To the operator, it is a chain. The boiler must produce effective heat. The pipes must carry it. The desired space must receive enough of it. Any attempt to judge the system requires knowing what can be observed and where. A cold surface does not explain its own cause. The source, route, and destination must be considered separately. This is difficult for a novice, because central systems enlarge the distance between an error and its symptom. An open fire presents its state directly. You can see flame, fuel, ash, and smoke. A pipe beneath a floor hides much of the process. When comfort fades, you cannot solve the problem by staring at the room. You need an understanding of what lies below it. The Turkish bath also reveals the social geometry of the house. Sophisticated pleasure in one space depends on technical care in another. Architecture separates those experiences. The Armstrongs and their guests encounter warmth as atmosphere. Staff encounter the means by which warmth is produced and extended. The same building can make labor invisible to the person receiving its result and unavoidable to the person responsible for it. Central heating did not make the fireplaces irrelevant. Cragside's enormous hearths remained part of its winter experience. That coexistence matters. A modern mind prefers clean succession stories. One technology arrives and the older one disappears. In a working country house, technologies can accumulate. Pipes warm some spaces or provide particular forms of comfort, while room fires continue to demand fuel and care. Innovation adds another tool, but it can also add another system to monitor. So the basement boiler is not a solution that closes the question of heat. It is one answer among several. It gives the house a hidden circulation of warmth. Yet the winter burden survives in distributed form. Some of it lies below the Turkish bath floor. Some waits in grates around the house. Some is carried upward as fuel. Your next problem is not how the mansion creates heat in principle. It is how that heat reaches each place people expect to be warm, and what happens to the labor when the route climbs through the building. The most spectacular fireplace at Cragside rises in the drawing room, about 6 meters high, and reported by the National Trust to weigh roughly 10 tons. It is almost architectural before it is domestic. A great stone presence built to dominate the space around it. A modern visitor can look at such a hearth and read warmth directly from scale. Surely a fireplace this large defeats a Northumbrian winter by its very existence. But size is not a fuel, and stone does not tend to flame. The fireplace makes the winter problem visible because it separates the object admired from the service required. Someone has to bring fuel toward the room. Someone has to prepare the grate, light the fire, judge whether it is drawing, attend it as the fuel settles, remove ash, and leave the hearth ready to be used again. The exact Cragside schedule for those tasks has not been recovered in the sources used here, and we should not assign an invented routine to a named servant. Contemporary service manuals show that these were recognized parts of household work. Cragside's surviving fireplaces show where that work ended. The distinction between public and service experience is especially sharp here. To the guest, the fire is atmosphere. It gives light, sound, movement, and a center to the room. To the worker, it is a changing physical state. A polished grate at 1 hour becomes an ash-filled grate at another. A bright fire becomes a low one. A room that will be occupied later has to be prepared before its need is announced by shivering people. The servant works in time ahead of comfort. The problem you face as a modern novice is therefore not simply whether you can make fire. You probably can, given dry fuel, time, and a forgiving grate. The harder question is whether you can make the correct fires in the correct rooms at the correct stages of the household day, while the central heating system performs a different share of the work. An isolated success is not household competence. A magnificent blaze in an empty room may be waste. A neglected bedroom fire may become the failure everyone notices. The drawing room fireplace also makes distance matter. Fuel does not appear at the hearth because it has entered the building. It must travel from storage, through service routes, and upward where required. The larger the house becomes, the more the location of heat determines the burden of supplying it. Every floor and corridor turns warmth back into weight. This is why the 6-meter hearth should not be dismissed as useless display. It was a real source of heat and a deliberate part of the room. The point is more exact. A source of heat remains only as dependable as the sequence that feeds and attends it. Lord Armstrong's house could enlarge the fireplace until it became monumental, but monumentality could not make the fire arrive on time. You now know enough to identify the next pressure. The house does have machinery to help move weight. Deep inside Cragside, water power can lift coal toward the upper floors. That sounds like the moment when design finally rescues you from the staircase. It does, but only for one part of the journey. The hydraulic jigger lift at Cragside rose about 9 meters. Staff used it for luggage and for heavy coal, the two kinds of load that reveal a country house as a vertical machine. Guests arrive with possessions that must reach bedrooms. Fires consume fuel in rooms far above the place where bulk weight can be received and stored. Without mechanical help, servants carry those demands through the building step by step. The lift changes that calculation. Water pressure does the work of raising the platform. A load placed at the lower level can emerge much closer to its destination without a person bearing the full weight up every stair. In a house already using water as stored power, this is an elegant answer to an ordinary physical problem. Yet watch the handoffs. Coal must be gathered into a movable load. It must reach the lift. The machine must be operated. At the upper stop, the fuel must be removed and divided according to need. It must then continue toward individual grates. None of those decisions belongs to the lift. Its job is vertical movement across about 9 meters. The very precision of that job tells us what remains outside it. For an experienced member of staff, the jigger becomes part of a route. The person knows what can be sent, when the lift is available, where the load emerges, and how far the work must continue. For you, it first appears as a machine to be understood. You may spend time discovering controls that another person used without hesitation. You may load badly, send too little, or create delay at the point where a second worker expects the coal to appear. The house measures competence not by whether the platform moves, but by whether the required fuel reaches the required grate before the room grows cold. This is the pattern of Cragside's designs. They do not replace the household chain. They shorten one difficult section and make the surrounding sections more dependent on timing. Once staff plan around the lift, a late load is not merely a late load. It can hold up the distribution of coal across several fires. Efficiency increases the value of teamwork. The jigger also corrects the romantic image of servant labor as a collection of small, picturesque actions. Coal is heavy. Luggage is heavy. A great house repeatedly moves material against gravity. The physical scale of service is one reason machinery mattered so much. Saving that effort was real. It reduced strain and accelerated work. We should not deny the benefit in order to make the survival story harsher. But assistance is not autonomy. The lift does not know that the drawing room will be used, that a guest has changed rooms, or that a fire needs a new supply before evening. It does not inspect the fuel or clean the grate. It cannot balance coal work against hot water, luggage, meals, and messages. Those judgments stay with people. By turning water pressure into upward movement, Lord Armstrong's house made one burden easier. It also made another fact impossible to miss. The coal may rise by machine, but the winter routine still has hands at both ends. To understand what the jigger saves, remove it for a moment. This is a conditional test, not a claim that the lift failed during a documented Cragside winter. No such event has been established in the research for this episode. We are asking what physically changes when the intended route is unavailable. The answer is immediate. The weight does not disappear. The destination does not move downstairs. Coal needed on an upper floor must travel by another route, and the obvious alternative is human carrying over stairs. A machine that had concentrated vertical movement into one lift now releases the burden back into repeated journeys. For you, the danger is not cinematic. The house does not collapse. There is no reason to invent an injured servant, a spilled load, or a night of catastrophe. The pressure comes from arithmetic the evidence does not need to quantify. Every manual journey takes time and strength. Every minute spent carrying is unavailable for grate cleaning, hot water, messages, food, or the next load. Winter service becomes vulnerable to delay because several tasks compete for the same bodies. This is also where modern confidence can become unfair to the past. We might say that anyone could carry coal if necessary. In the narrowest sense, that is true. A fit person can lift a container and climb a staircase. But the Victorian household problem is not a single container on a single stair. It is maintaining the full pattern of service after the machine that organized one part of it has disappeared. Endurance matters. Scheduling matters. Knowing which demand can be postponed matters. The experienced worker's advantage is not superhuman strength. It is the ability to reorganize without losing sight of the house. The person knows which fires are most urgent, which route is practicable, which colleague can help, and how to restore the normal sequence once the obstruction passes. You know only that coal is heavy, and someone upstairs wants warmth. That difference grows with every journey. A novice responds to the latest complaint because it is loudest. A practice team protects the next hour as well as the present minute. They can decide that one grate has enough fuel to wait, another room must be prepared now, and a third demand can be combined with a route already being made. The knowledge saves steps before strength is spent. Without it, you may work harder than anyone and still deliver less useful heat. The lift, therefore, saves more than climbing when it is integrated into a schedule. It gives staff a predictable point around which loads can be organized. Remove that point, and the problem is not simply extra exertion. The sequence loses one of its anchors. Recovery depends on people who understand the pattern well enough to build a temporary one. So the conditional failure teaches a bounded lesson. The jigger saved labor because it displaced real weight. If the route failed, that weight returned to people and stairs. Lord Armstrong's machinery could reduce the body's burden, but it could not repeal the burden's existence. A service manual published in 1880 gives us the rhythm that Cragside's surviving machines cannot preserve on their own. It is not a Cragside staff diary. It does not name Walter Mavin, Andrew Crozier, or any woman working in the house. It describes how servants were expected to perform their duties in well-run households, and it must remain a comparison rather than a borrowed schedule. With that boundary clear, the manual becomes valuable. In winter, selected passages place a housemaid or kitchen maid on her feet at 6:30. The precise hour varied with establishment and role, but the important fact is what follows. Fires are not one morning task completed and forgotten. Grates have to be cleaned. Fires have to be laid and lit. Bedroom fires require care. Hot water has to be carried. Coal and wood appear as recurring material demands, assigned in some households to male servants. The day is a series of returns. This repeated structure is what the grand rooms conceal. A guest wakes to a prepared room and experiences warmth as the beginning of the day. The servant responsible for that result has begun earlier, often in colder service spaces, preparing the setting in which someone else will wake comfortably. Ash from yesterday must be removed before today's fire can be made. Fuel must be available before flame. Water must be heated before it can be delivered. Sequence runs backward from every polished result. Now place yourself inside that pattern. Rising at 6:30 is not by itself beyond modern endurance. Many people rise earlier. The survival problem lies in waking into a chain you do not understand and having no spare morning in which to learn it. Which grate is cleaned first? Which room is occupied? Which fire must be established early enough to change the temperature before its owner arrives? Where is hot water collected? And who expects it? Which task can be interrupted by a message from the butler? The clock creates pressure because the work has dependencies. The manual also shows why a list of designs cannot tell the household story. Central heating exists, yet the period still expects grate work and bedroom fires. Mechanical lifting can move coal, yet servants still distribute fuel. Water-powered devices perform motion, yet hot water still has to reach bodies and rooms. Technology enters the routine without erasing the routine. There is a temptation in second-person history to assign all of this to you as though we had discovered one precise shift. We have not. Cragside's exact winter roster and timetable are incomplete in the evidence assembled here. We do not know which unnamed worker rose at which minute or which sequence belonged to which date. The honest documentary uses the manual to define contemporary expectations, then lets the house show the particular machines that shaped work on this estate. That distinction actually makes the story stronger. A fabricated schedule would give you false certainty. The surviving evidence gives you a more demanding truth. Winter service depended on a practiced rhythm that could vary by house and by day. The workers did not merely obey one fixed Victorian timetable. They adapted general standards to local rooms, local machinery, local employers, and the changing demands of guests. Your failure would begin when you mistook repetition for simplicity. A task repeated every morning can look easy from the outside. Repetition is often what makes it skilled. The worker has learned where effort is wasted, which signs matter, and how to finish one job so the next can begin. The modern novice has to think deliberately about actions the experienced servant has joined into a flow. By breakfast, you may have lit several fires and still be behind. Ash waits where you have not reached it. Hot water is late. Coal has arrived at an upper level, but not at the correct grate. One poorly ordered choice passes delay forward. No single error kills you. The day becomes unmanageable by accumulation. The 1880 manual cannot lend its exact 6:30 clock to a named Cragside servant. It can show why the house's winter comfort had a clock at all. Fires cool. Water cools. People wake. Rooms fill. Each result has a time when it is useful. And skill lies in making the work arrive just before the need becomes visible. Hot water is one of the easiest comforts to misremember as a single service. Turn a tap, and supply, heat, pressure, and delivery appear as one event. In a Victorian country house, those contributions could remain much easier to see. Water had to be available. Heat had to be applied. The result had to reach the place and moment where a person expected it. The 1880 service manual treats hot water as part of repeated household duty. Again, it is a model of period practice rather than Cragside's recovered rota. Its value is to reveal the physical action hidden inside the phrase. Hot water may have to be carried. Bedroom work can therefore connect a distant source of heat with a container, a service stair, a timetable, and a person waiting above. Cragside complicates that basic picture through its own water and heating systems. The estate uses managed water for hydraulic and hydroelectric purposes. The Turkish bath has heated pipes beneath its floor. These advances do not allow us to claim that every bedroom possessed modern hot and cold water on demand, nor do they turn every warm container into the product of one central machine. The documentary must keep the supported pieces distinct. For your winter assignment, distinction is the challenge. Water pressure is not water temperature. A hydraulic system that moves a lift does not necessarily answer a bedroom request. The heating of pipes beneath the bath floor does not tell you where washing water is prepared. You have to know which route serves which purpose, and which part of the route is human. This episode will not follow sheets through the wet and dry processes of a Victorian laundry. That work belongs to a separate Audley End story, already in the channel's production world. Here, hot water matters because it joins winter warmth to personal service. It has to be useful at a bedroom, basin, bath, or service task at the correct time. A supply that arrives late has lost part of its value even if nothing has mechanically failed. Temperature makes the clock unforgiving. Hot water begins cooling as soon as it leaves the source. Carrying takes time. Stairs turn time into effort. A delay at the grate, lift, or pantry can therefore alter work that seems unrelated. This is how a great house defeats the novice. The systems do not have to collapse, they only have to compete. An experienced servant knows where containers are kept, which route avoids the public rooms, which demand comes first, and how the delivery fits among fires, cleaning, dressing, and breakfast. You may know that hot water is needed and still fail to produce it in usable order. General awareness is not a schedule. The hidden chain also changes how we understand luxury. Abundant hot water is not merely water made warm. It is water made warm without making the person receiving it wait, ask twice, carry it, or encounter the apparatus. The labor is successful when the chain disappears at the point of use. At Cragside, water can move machines, and electricity can illuminate rooms, yet neither achievement makes this service automatic. The comfort at the top of the route still depends on someone below recognizing that supply, heat, and delivery are three different problems. A modern tap conceals their separation. Lord Armstrong's house gives each one a place and gives you no reason to know it. Long before water becomes light in the library or motion in the kitchen, it belongs to the landscape. Cragside's grounds were not merely a picturesque border around the house. Tumbleton and Nellie's Moss formed part of a managed water system, storing and directing the resource used for hydraulic and hydroelectric purposes. The lakes, pumping setups, upper water, channels, pipes, and gradients turned the estate itself into infrastructure. This is the first system that refuses to fit inside the mansion. Stand in a room lit by electricity, and the light appears to begin at the lamp. Watch the roasting spit revolve, and the motion appears to belong to the gears in the kitchen. Ride a hydraulic lift, and the force seems to reside beneath the platform. In every case, the visible action is only the end of a longer path. Water has been collected somewhere else. It has been held high enough to work or moved toward one. Gravity and pressure have been made to serve a purpose. The beautiful lake is therefore doing more than reflecting sky. It is part of the route by which work enters the house. William Armstrong understood water as something that could be controlled through engineering. At Cragside, that understanding reshaped both the grounds and the domestic experience. Yet control did not make the supply imaginary. Water still had location, direction, volume, and changing availability. Machinery did not free the household from the landscape. It made the household more capable of drawing work from it. For you, the modern novice, this creates an early trap. The estate seems generous with water. There are lakes, falls, damp ground, and engineered courses. It is easy to assume that presence equals availability. But water becomes useful only when it reaches the right machine at the level and pressure that machine requires. A reservoir below the useful level is not the same as water under effective head. Water stored in the grounds is not yet pressure in the lift. A stream moving through the estate is not automatically current in a wire. The route matters as much as the resource. Nor does one successful use prove that every other water service is secure. The mill can be turning, while a different route deserves care. The lift can rise while the generating gear faces another limit. To a stranger, all three effects seem to confirm that water is working. To an operator, they are separate observations. The estate has to be read as a map of destinations, not as one large reservoir with a single answer. Winter makes that map more urgent, because hesitation indoors may begin with a state far beyond the room where the symptom appears. Cragside's water landscape also makes duty difficult to see. Inside a conventional modern home, the failure of a utility usually arrives as a clear absence. A tap stops. A light goes out. A boiler displays a warning. Here, several different symptoms might begin beyond the walls. The person noticing the result may not be the person closest to the cause. Contact and fault-finding, therefore, become part of the work. The house needs people who can distinguish a local fault from a wider supply problem, who understand what shares a source, and who know whom to tell. Nothing in the evidence permits us to invent a frozen reservoir or a dramatic winter failure at Cragside. We do not need one. The documented setup is enough. A house celebrated for indoor engineering begins with outdoor dependencies. Its comfort is drawn through a chain that reaches across the estate. Before water can save a single step of labor inside, it has to be stored, lifted, directed, and delivered to the place where that step can be saved. This is the first great reversal of the house. What looks like nature is partly machinery. What looks like machinery still depends on nature. And between the two stands a human operator who has to know which state is changing. Water enters the kitchen in another form. A barker's mill drove the roasting spit through a sequence of mechanical links. Water turned the mill. A shaft carried the motion. Bevel gears and cogs redirected it toward the spit above the range. Meat that would otherwise require a person to keep turning it could rotate by machine. This is the sort of design that makes Cragside feel truly intelligent. The machine answers a repetitive bodily task with continuous power drawn from the estate. It saves a worker from standing beside heat and performing the same motion for a long cooking period. The benefit is practical, not merely theatrical. Follow the motion closely, however, and the boundary appears. The mill can turn. It cannot decide. Someone chooses what is to be roasted. Someone prepares and mounts it. Someone establishes and manages the heat of the range. Someone observes the food as its surface changes, judges the progress of cooking, adjusts position or timing, and removes the result. The machine performs rotation within a culinary process that remains full of human judgment. This matters in winter because the kitchen is not an isolated workshop. It is producing meals on a household schedule while sharing the wider burdens of fuel, water, heat, cleaning, and messages. If the spit rotates perfectly while the fire is wrong, motion has not produced dinner. If the food cooks well but is late, the service has still failed in public. The machine can improve one variable while leaving every surrounding variable exposed. For you, the barker's mill creates a special kind of confusion. The visible part may appear self-explanatory. Gears turn, so the spit turns. But recognizing movement does not tell you whether the movement is correct, how it is started or stopped in the local setup, what requires lubrication or cleaning, or what symptom indicates trouble elsewhere in the route. The evidence used here identifies the broad machine, not a complete operator's handbook. That missing local knowledge is exactly the point. The mill also brings the landscape back into the kitchen. The rotation above the range begins in managed water beyond the room. A cook responding to the roast and a worker responsible for the water-powered apparatus therefore occupy different points in a connected process. The machine compresses distance for the guest. The roast arrives without revealing that its steady turning began outside the house. This does not make design a trick. Labor saved is labor saved. A continuous mechanical turn can improve consistency and reduce exhausting exposure beside the range. Lord Armstrong's engineering deserved care because it converted natural force into useful domestic work. The mistake is believing that useful work and complete work are the same. The barker's mill owns one verb, turn. The household still owns prepare, heat, watch, judge, correct, carry, carve, serve, and clean. Cragside becomes more efficient by moving one action from a body to a machine. It does not become a kitchen without bodies. That distinction will matter when we return to the smart home promise. The machinery is not pretending to be autonomous. We are the ones tempted to grant it autonomy after the fact. The Victorians who worked around it knew exactly where its power ended, because that was where their labor began again. At this point, a fair objection has to be heard. If the hydraulic lift raised coal and the Barker's mill turned the spit, perhaps Lord Armstrong's designs genuinely reduced the need for servants. Perhaps our survival test exaggerates human dependence because it is determined to find labor behind every machine. The answer begins by granting what is true. These machines did save effort. The jigger reduced the need to carry heavy loads through the full vertical rise. The water-powered spit removed long periods of manual turning. Central heating carried warmth through hidden pipes. Electric light changed the labor and material of illumination. To describe those advances as meaningless would be inaccurate. But labor saving has a scale. A machine can remove an action without removing the process that contains it. The lift raises the coal, but does not decide which rooms need fires. The mill turns the meat, but does not cook dinner by judgment. The lamp produces light, but may still require a servant to make the link, a caretaker to tend the system, a butler to communicate demand, and a powerhouse to allocate current. Each advance shifts work toward loading, scheduling, watching, communicating, maintaining, and correcting. This is why the number of visible motions is a poor measure of dependence. A servant no longer turning a spit every moment may now be free to perform other kitchen work. A coal load moved by lift may travel faster, enabling a larger house to support more demands. Efficiency can increase the scale of expected service. The household absorbs the saved effort and asks the remaining staff to produce a smoother result. Cragside did not need people because its machines were failures. It needed people because successful machines operate inside human systems. The more specialized the machine, the more precisely someone must understand the boundary of its job. A worker who expects too little from it wastes what it can do. A worker who expects too much leaves essential work undone. As a modern novice, you are vulnerable to the second mistake. The language of smart homes has trained you to expect systems to monitor themselves, respond to users, and conceal technical choices. At Cragside, the innovations are brilliant but literal. Water turns what the engineering connects to it. Electricity lights what current reaches. Hydraulics moves what has been loaded. None of these forces knows the household's intention. The servants provide that missing intention. They convert a list of devices into a day that appears orderly. Their role changes as machinery enters the house, but it does not disappear. In some respects, it becomes more technical. A worker must learn not only fire and water, but contacts, signals, lifts, and the practical behavior of experimental gear. The responsible conclusion is therefore not that technology did nothing for labor. It is that technology reorganized labor around new points of leverage and new points of failure. Lord Armstrong could save a body from turning a spit and still depend on a household full of judgment. Cragside becomes smart in the space between the motion a machine can perform and the result a person knows is required. Before the adapted swan lamps entered the library, Cragside had already brought electric light indoors in a more demanding form. In 1878, water power drove arc lighting in the gallery. The date makes the experiment early, but the machine makes it useful to our survival story. An arc light produces illumination across a gap between carbon rods. Current passes, an arc forms, and the result can be intensely bright. Yet the rods do not remain unchanged. They burn away as the light operates. If the gap becomes too wide or too narrow, the arc cannot simply continue as though nothing has happened. The changing distance has to be regulated. This is the opposite of the fixed modern object suggested by the word lamp. The source of light consumes part of its own working setup. As the light burns, that setup changes. Lord Armstrong's indoor arc light therefore belongs to a world in which illumination is visibly technical. It is not just current arriving at a fitting. It is current crossing a maintained gap between materials that are gradually being used. A regulating machine can help preserve that gap, but someone must still understand that carbon rods are consumable, that the arc has a proper state, and that a change in light may announce a change in spacing rather than a mysterious failure of electricity itself. For a modern novice, the first problem is diagnostic language. You see flicker, weakness, or interruption, and think the light is bad. An experienced operator sees a physical process with several possible causes. Current, contact, carbon, gap, and machine are different questions. Guessing at one, because it is familiar, can waste the time needed to test another. The arc light also gives Walter Mavin's later documented office a deeper history. A caretaker of electric light did not care for an abstract glow. He inherited a succession of technologies whose parts aged, burned, shifted, and sometimes misbehaved. The service changed as Cragside moved from arc lighting toward incandescent lamps, but the need for technical care did not vanish with the newer form. This is how the documentary develops. In 1870, hidden pipes add central heat without removing room fires. In 1878, an electric arc adds brilliant light while creating a maintained carbon gap. In 1880, incandescent lamps enter the library but rely on unfamiliar manual contacts. Each advance solves something and exposes something else. The house's public story calls this progress correctly. The private story asks who carries the new knowledge. Every new system has to be fitted into duties already crowded with heat, fuel, water, food, and messages. A person who once understood lamps of flame now encounters lamps whose working material is not burned oil, but carbon rods or an electrically heated filament. Training cannot be assumed merely because both objects create light. Imagine entering the gallery after the first astonishment has passed. The light is no longer a miracle in that moment. It is a state to be sustained. Its brightness must remain useful. Its changing parts must be recognized. If the gap drifts beyond working limits, admiration will not restore it. Nothing here proves that a particular winter night at Cragside ended in darkness. The evidence supports the machine, not a disaster. The more revealing fact is that normal use carried its own maintenance problem. No storm is required. No villain sabotages the wires. The rods simply burn as the lamp fulfills its purpose. That is one of the quiet dangers of Lord Armstrong's smart home. Success consumes resources and changes gear. The better the light works, the more surely the carbon changes. Survival depends on people who can anticipate the cost of ordinary use before an ordinary change becomes an extraordinary interruption. The power system had a named caretaker. Walter Mavin appears in the National Trust's record with an office that sounds both modest and immense: Caretaker of Electric Light. The title is one of the most useful pieces of evidence in the entire house. It tells us that electric light, for all its wonder, was not treated as a finished commodity that could be forgotten once installed. It required care, and someone carried duty for giving that care. We should resist the temptation to turn Walter into a character whose every movement and thought can be recovered. The sources used here do not preserve a complete winter shift in his voice. They do not place him in a precisely dated conversation with Andrew Crozier. What they preserve is his role in Armstrong's experimental generating technology. That role is enough to correct the easy story of an inventor and his miraculous house. Between design and domestic comfort stood an operator. To care for electric light in this period meant living close to its physical limits. The generating gear had to answer changing demand. Dynamos and batteries formed part of the mature powerhouse setup. Current was not simply everywhere, awaiting use. The household communicated when more was required. Equipment, water power, storage, wiring, lamps, and room allocation belonged to one service, but each could present a different question. The caretaker's expertise lay not in admiring the system, but in recognizing what its state required. Imagine only the difference between knowing a principle and recognizing a particular machine. You may understand that moving water can produce mechanical work, and that a dynamo can generate electricity. That does not mean you can identify the sound, movement, heat, smell, or response that tells an experienced operator whether the gear before you is behaving normally. A manual can name components. Practice teaches what a small deviation means before it becomes an interruption. Cragside depended on that second kind of knowledge. This is where the survival test becomes less theatrical and more severe. You are unlikely to be defeated by one secret lever marked with an ominous warning. You are more likely to lose time because nothing looks obviously wrong. A request arrives. The result is inadequate. You do not know whether demand exceeded supply, whether the wrong rooms were selected, whether a lamp was troublesome, whether a local link failed, or whether the problem lies farther back in the system. Every minute spent guessing belongs to a house that continues asking for light, heat, food, water, and service. Walter's title also makes the link between prestige and maintenance explicit. Cragside could astonish visitors precisely because someone was attending to what visitors did not see. Experimental technology produces a brilliant public effect by concentrating private uncertainty in the hands of a skilled worker. The glow in the library may look effortless. The office of Caretaker of Electric Light proves that effort has merely moved. So when the word smart is applied to Cragside, Walter Mavin must stand inside it. The house did not possess intelligence in the modern automated sense. It possessed machines designed by remarkable people and kept usable by other remarkable people, whose decisions were woven into daily life. Electric light had a caretaker because electric light needed care. Remove the office, ignore the experience contained in it, and the wonder begins to lose its reliability. The smallest motion in Cragside's electrical history may be the one that feels most foreign. In December 1880, adapted lamps in the library were electrified. A January 1881 letter by Armstrong, summarized by the University of Leeds research project, Electrifying the Country House, explains the switching method. An adapted vase could be lifted or replaced so that a wire entered or left a dish of mercury. The servant's hand completed or broke the electrical contact. We should be exact about what that source allows. The Leeds project reports the archival description. The letter has not been independently inspected for this episode, so its wording will not be quoted as though it lay open before us. National Trust interpretation also describes early library lamps using mercury bowls. Neither source documents a poisoning event. We will not invent symptoms, exposure, or injury. The supported machine is strange enough. Approach the lamp with modern habits and you search for a switch. The lamp offers an object that appears to belong to decoration. The vase is part of the control. Move it in the expected way, and the wire changes its contact with mercury. The circuit changes state. Light that seems to announce the future depends on an action that does not resemble the future at all. This is more than an amusing detail. It shows how early domestic electricity entered rooms through adaptations, experiments, and manual knowledge. The user interface had not yet settled into the familiar forms that make electricity seem natural. A servant had to know which object was functional, how it should be handled, and what result to expect. For you, the danger is not that mercury leaps from the dish in a sensational accident. The evidence gives no such story. The danger is ignorance combined with confidence. You may leave a link made when it should be broken. You may fail to recognize why moving the vase matters. You may treat the functional object as ornament, or treat an ornament as a control. The room does not explain the system in your language. The adapted lamp also joins the highest and lowest levels of the household. Joseph Swan's incandescent technology represents a major development in electric lighting. Armstrong's Cragside became a celebrated site of its domestic use. Yet the moment of illumination in the library still passed through a servant's hand. Invention arrived not as a finished consumer product, but as a working setup that people learned to operate. Consider what successful service does to this scene. The guest sees light when light is wanted. The contact method disappears into routine. The more reliably the servant performs it, the more the lamp appears to belong naturally to the room. Human skill converts an experimental procedure into atmosphere. The same skill includes knowing when an unexpected result requires someone else. If the contact is made and the lamp does not behave, is the local action wrong? Is the lamp troublesome? Is current unavailable? Or has power been directed elsewhere? The servant does not need to repair every component. the servant needs to recognize the boundary between local use and a problem for the electrical caretaker. This is where Walter Mavin's office and Andrew Crozier's telephone begin to converge. The vase, the wire, the mercury, the limited current, and the powerhouse are not separate curiosities. They are levels in one human-operated service. A hand completes the circuit in the library. A butler reports the need of occupied rooms. A caretaker answers for the generating technology. The lamp is often used to symbolize the moment modern domestic life began. At Cragside, it can symbolize something more honest. Modernity began in pieces. One of those pieces sat in a dish of mercury, waiting for a servant who knew that the vase was not merely a vase. Inside the house, Andrew Crozier held a different role in the same chain. As butler, he knew the pattern of domestic life from the service side. He knew where the Armstrongs and their guests had gathered, which rooms were about to be used, and which requests belonged to the order of the evening. That knowledge did not make him the powerhouse operator. It made him the person capable of translating household demand into a message the power system could answer. The estate telephone joined those two forms of expertise. Crozier could ask that current be directed to the occupied rooms. At the powerhouse, the request could be met within the system's limits. The setup was advanced, but it was not automatic. The machinery did not follow the family from drawing room to library. It did not infer that a guest had retired or that another public room was about to fill. Human beings supplied those facts. Now the first question in our winter test can be answered properly. Which rooms receive the electricity? Not all of them, not necessarily the grandest. The rooms in use receive first claim, and identifying them requires someone close to the household. The electrical choice is therefore also a social choice. Power follows occupancy, status, schedule, and what the family expects. This is a subtle burden because the successful result erases the decision. Guests enter a lit room and see light. They do not see the alternative room left dark, the message that traveled from the pantry, or the limit that forced a choice. Scarcity has been managed before it reaches them. The purpose of high service is not merely to perform work. It is to prevent the served person from encountering the work as a problem. Your modern habits are poorly suited to that setup. When you enter a room now, you expect the supply to be waiting. If there is a switch, you expect the decision to be local. If the light fails, you treat it as a fault rather than a possible result of rationed current. At Cragside, those assumptions would make you slow. You would look for a control in the room when the deciding message began elsewhere. You might interpret darkness as breakdown when it was simply the limit of the system being respected. The telephone lets the house adjust, but it also creates a fragile link. Someone must be present to hear what the household requires. Someone must know whom to call. Someone at the other end must understand the generating gear and the request. The object carries a message, not judgment. A modern device can seem intelligent because software makes choices behind the surface. This Victorian device reveals the opposite. Its value depends on the minds at both ends. There is no need to invent a quarrel between Crozier and Mavin, or a night when a message failed. Their documented roles already show the structure. One man holds the immediate map of domestic need. The other holds the immediate map of what the electrical system can provide. The house becomes responsive when those maps meet. That division of knowledge is one reason you cannot replace a servant by learning a list of tasks. A list might tell you to telephone the Powerhouse. It may not tell you when a room has become important, which competing request can wait, or how a small change in the family's movement alters the evening's order. Nor can it give you Walter's knowledge of the response available at the other end. Teamwork is not an extra layer placed on top of the system. Teamwork is part of the system. The light in an occupied room, then, is a joint result. Water and machinery make current possible. Crozier identifies demand. The telephone transmits it. Mavin and the generating setup answer within a limited supply. The sequence contains no magic, but it does contain something a brochure about Britain's first smart home can easily lose. Every advanced machine remains attached to a person who knows what the machine cannot decide. By 1884, Cragside's electric light had moved beyond the first arc trial and the adapted library lamps. It had also produced a documented problem. A letter summarized by the University of Leeds project refers to trouble with several lamps and asks whether they should be sent to the Edison Swan Company for checking or replaced. This is the real turn our developing story needs. We do not have to invent a winter blackout. The record gives us something more ordinary and therefore more persuasive. Individual lamps could become troublesome, and the answer might involve a check beyond the household or a new lamp from the maker. For Lord Armstrong, the inventor and patron of new technology, such trouble belonged to trial and error. A new domestic system improves through testing, letters, changes, and better parts. For the household trying to use the result, the same process arrives as doubt. A room expected to be lit contains a lamp that may not answer as intended. Someone has to notice, report, test, and decide what happens next. This is where a named caretaker matters more than a dramatic event. Walter Mavin's office places duty between the symptom and the solution. He may not manufacture every lamp or control every choice about a new lamp, but the house needs someone capable of distinguishing a local operating error from a troublesome object. Without that judgment, everything becomes either the servant's fault or the machine's mystery. Now take the role yourself. A lamp fails to do what you expected. You know that the house cannot light every room at once. You know that early contacts can be unfamiliar. You know that incandescent lamps themselves have caused documented trouble. Which cause applies here? Is current being directed elsewhere? Has the contact been made? Is the particular lamp defective? Does it require care at Cragside, or must it be inspected by the company connected with its manufacture? These are not questions a visitor answers from first principles while guests wait. They belong to accumulated practice and to records of previous behavior. A caretaker who has watched the system over time can compare today's symptom with yesterday's behavior. You have no yesterday. The 1884 letter also punctures the myth that prestige makes a machine dependable. Cragside's fame made its gear important, not infallible. The Armstrong name, the Swan link, and the novelty of hydroelectric domestic light could not make a troublesome lamp behave. The new gear remains material: glass, filament, Contact, wiring, and supply have to work together. At the same time, we should not twist ordinary trouble into proof that the system was useless. A letter about checking or replacing a lamp is evidence of upkeep, not collapse. Modern homes also contain failed bulbs and defective gear. What makes the Victorian case distinctive is the novelty of the service, the limited supply, and the smaller body of familiar routines around it. When something goes wrong, fewer parts of the answer are obvious to an untrained user. The documentary has now reached a turning point. The house has grown. Demand for electrical service has grown with it. Troublesome lamps show one kind of pressure at the room. Distance and output show another at the generating system. Around 1886, Cragside responded not by pretending the early setup was complete, but by adding infrastructure nearer the house. That change reveals Lord Armstrong's smart home as a prototype in motion. Its history is not a clean march from darkness to light. It is a series of solutions tested by use, each leaving evidence of what the next solution had to improve. Around 1886, a second generating setup was developed nearer Cragside. The University of Leeds study explains the pressure behind the change. The earlier and more distant system was not efficient enough, as the household's demand increased. Distance had become part of the electrical problem. The first setup demonstrated that water power could provide domestic light. Success encouraged more use. More use exposed limits that mattered less when the service was smaller. The solution required more than asking the old system to try harder. Infrastructure moved closer to demand. This is the moment when the phrase "first smart home" becomes most instructive. A finished consumer product is judged at release. Cragside was built through trial, use, and change. Lord Armstrong's estate functioned as a place where new domestic setups could be installed, observed, altered, and enlarged. The house learned only because people learned from it. For Walter Mavin and those responsible for the gear, a nearer generating system did not erase the history of the earlier one. It introduced a changed network. New routes and tools had to be understood. If more rooms or devices could be served, the pattern of demand changed again. More power can reduce one scarcity while increasing reliance on the service. The butler's telephone sits inside that story. When current is limited, a call routes it. When generation expands, calls still matter because households do not become static. Guests move. Rooms are opened or closed. Service spaces have their own needs. A larger system may answer more requests, but someone must continue turning household knowledge into technical demand. The modern novice is likely to read an upgrade as easier work. The source is nearer, so the work should be easier. In one respect it is. Inefficiency caused by the more distant setup is being addressed. In another respect, the house now contains more historical layers. You must know which gear serves which part of the mature system and what has changed from the earlier plan. This is a common feature of old houses that remain in use. A new route does not always remove every trace of the old one. Each change leaves links, spaces, habits, and exceptions. The building becomes a record of fixes. To an experienced worker, that record is legible. To you, it is a maze of pipes, wires, rooms, and machines whose ages do not announce their functions. The circa 1886 change also gives us a documented answer to one of the episode's central questions. What kind of problems arose in Lord Armstrong's advanced house? Not merely sensational accidents. Rising demand made the first distant setup insufficiently efficient. The response was money spent on a second system nearer the mansion. Progress created its own next need. That is precisely how a documentary ordeal develops. The 1878 arc light demands control. The 1880 lamps demand unfamiliar contact. The mature house cannot light every room at once, so Crozier telephones the Powerhouse. Several lamps cause trouble by 1884. Demand rises, and around 1886, the estate adds generating gear nearer the house. Each stage is connected to the pressure produced by the previous success. The changes also make your survival test more plausible, as a test of knowledge rather than strength. You do not lose because you cannot endure cold for one night. You lose because the house has a memory you do not share. Its current form assumes that someone knows why gear was added, what shortfall it answered, and which limits still remain. Lord Armstrong could move the power closer. He could not put the history of every decision inside the wall where a stranger would find it. That history remained with plans, letters, and the people who worked the system. You enter after the changes and encounter only the result. The result looks clever. The reasons are what keep it running. One archival statement, reported by the University of Leeds project, places a final limit around Cragside's water-powered electric light. It says that water power could provide lighting for 10 months of the year, while the remaining 2 months were uncertain. The statement is important. It is also easy to misuse. The source summary does not identify the 2 uncertain months. It does not say they were winter months. It does not give us permission to blame frost, drought, low water, or any other particular cause. It does not record the whole house failing on a named night. We cannot move the uncertainty into January merely because our title contains winter. What the record proves is narrower. Annual water-powered supply was not assumed to be equally secure at all times. Lord Armstrong's electrical system had a seasonal or annual planning question whose precise calendar location is not preserved in the summary available to us. That uncertainty matters even without a dramatic scene. A household becoming accustomed to electric light must consider what happens when the primary water-powered setup may not answer throughout the year. Batteries formed part of the mature system, and generating setups changed over time, but the surviving statement still tells us that water power had limits. A smart home built on a landscape does not escape variation in the landscape merely by converting water into current. For you, this is a lesson in resisting a false answer. You want the 2 months named because a named danger is easier to narrate. If they were winter, the title would seem neatly vindicated. If they were dry summer months, another explanation would emerge. The honest response is to stop where the evidence stops. An experienced operator does not have the luxury of treating uncertainty as empty space. Even if the archival summary leaves us without the months, the historical household had to live through the actual variation. People responsible for power would observe water levels, how the gear behaved, stored power, and demand. They would know whether current supply felt generous, constrained, or doubtful in a way a visitor could not infer from the date alone. This difference between historical experience and surviving documentation is important. The people at Cragside knew many things that never reached a letter, or that survive in records not recovered here. Our inability to name the months does not mean they lacked practical knowledge. It means we cannot borrow their certainty. The survival test, therefore, changes again. You are not only missing the technique of making a contact or regulating a lamp, you are missing the estate's calendar of expectation. Which signs warn the Powerhouse staff that supply may tighten? How does the household adjust demand? Which rooms are prioritized when current is limited? The telephone can carry a decision, but someone must understand the facts that make the choice necessary. There is restraint in this part of the story, but not weakness. A fabricated winter shortage would give us one loud problem. The documented uncertainty gives us a deeper one. Lord Armstrong's house relied on people able to operate between what was available and what was wanted, even when supply varied across the year. So remember the numbers exactly as the source allows them. 10 months supported by water power, 2 months uncertain, months unnamed. The record proves a limit and refuses to decorate it. That refusal is part of the documentary. Survival history becomes trustworthy when it knows which door must remain closed. Electricity at Cragside did more than make lamps glow. The developing system also supported messages and warnings, including dinner gongs and fire alarms. These functions widen the survival story because they show that a great house depends on messages moving as reliably as material. A dinner gong may sound ceremonial, but within service, it coordinates time. It announces a transition that many departments have been preparing toward. Food, room readiness, dress, lighting, and staff position converge on a shared moment. The signal does not produce dinner. It tells the household that a planned sequence has reached the point where people must move. A fire alarm carries a more urgent kind of warning. Its purpose is not atmosphere or convenience. It is to make danger known across distance. In a large building divided by floors, corridors, closed doors, public rooms, and service spaces, the speed and clarity of warning matter. Electricity becomes part of safety because it helps a local observation become a household response. Now return to Andrew Crozier's telephone. It too converts knowledge in one place into action somewhere else. The butler knows which rooms require current. The Powerhouse knows what the generating setup can provide. The telephone joins demand to available power. The gong joins preparation to movement. The alarm joins detection to response. None of these systems guarantees that the message is correct, understood, or acted upon. A signal travels. A person interprets it. For the modern novice, this message network creates another form of overload. A bell, gong, alarm, and telephone may each demand a different response. Sound does not explain priority. You have to know whether it marks routine, instruction, or danger, and where your role sits in the chain that follows. Ignoring a signal can be serious. Responding to the wrong one in the wrong way can abandon another task at its critical moment. Experienced servants learned the acoustic map of the house. The distinction between one summons and another became part of work. A signal heard from a service room carried context supplied by time of day, household activity, and previous instruction. You hear only noise until someone teaches you what it means. This is how an advanced house creates dependence without becoming weak. Clear messages improve teamwork, but teamwork depends on shared rules. A telephone is useful because both ends know the purpose of the call. A gong is useful because the household shares its meaning. A fire alarm is useful because people know what the warning asks them to do. Lord Armstrong's smart home therefore moves three invisible things. Electricity moves through wires. Messages move through signals. Responsibility moves toward the person expected to answer. The first two can travel rapidly. The third remains human. By the mature stage of Cragside, the service staff are not merely carrying coal and hot water. They are working inside a network of timed instructions and technical indications. The house has become more responsive because people can communicate across it. It has also become less forgiving of anyone who cannot tell a dinner gong from a demand that should interrupt dinner. The telephone in the pantry is now no longer one curious object at the beginning of our story. It belongs to a larger message system, holding the household together. When we test how your mistakes could accumulate, missed messages will not sit at the edge of the sequence. They will run through the middle of it. We can now test the house as a whole. What follows is a conditional failure map built from documented machines and limits. It is not a recovered night at Cragside. No source in this episode records Lord Armstrong's household collapsing through this sequence. The purpose is to discover what an untrained novice would have to keep right at the same time. The evening begins with occupancy. Family or guests settle into rooms whose need for light must be recognized. You misread the household's movement and request current for yesterday's setup. The Powerhouse answers the message you gave, not the message you should have given. A room people intend to use remains dark, while available light is directed elsewhere. You treat the darkness as a local lamp fault. At one fitting, that is plausible. Cragside correspondence documents Troublesome Lamps in 1884. At an earlier adapted fitting, the contact itself may depend on a servant moving a vase so a wire meets Mercury. At an arc light, the changing gap between carbon rods belongs to the working state. Three forms of electrical difficulty can produce one broad complaint. The light is wrong. You do not know which history you are standing inside. While you investigate, the heat problem continues on a separate route. The bright rooms, if you have managed to light them, are not warmed by the electricity. Central heating carries heat through pipes, including beneath the Turkish bath floor, while fireplaces still serve individual spaces. A weak fire is not corrected by the Powerhouse. It needs fuel, draft, and care. Coal has reached an upper level by the hydraulic jigger, if the route and timing have been managed. The lift has saved the steepest part of the burden, but the fuel is not yet inside every grate. Your delay at the lamps now meets your delay at the fires. A load waits in one place while occupied rooms consume what was delivered earlier. Hot water has its own clock. It begins to cool after heating. If it must be carried, every interruption reduces its usefulness. The person waiting for it does not care that your electrical diagnosis is becoming more sophisticated. A household demand is judged at delivery. In the kitchen, the Barker's mill may turn the roasting spit with perfect regularity. The roast can still fail if the range is poorly managed, or the human judgment around preparation and timing is late. The machine performs its single motion faithfully, while the wider dinner falls behind. Then a gong announces the moment toward which the work was supposed to converge. Now the modern instinct is to search for one root cause. There is none. You have made several small mistakes because the house divided its needs across systems you mentally joined together. You assumed electricity meant heat. You assumed movement meant completion. You assumed a signal carried its own explanation. You assumed that knowing what a device does would tell you when the household needs it. The consequences begin to reinforce one another. Time spent carrying coal by an alternate route, if the jigger is unavailable, is time not spent at grates. Time spent testing a lamp is time not spent delivering water. A delayed meal changes which rooms remain occupied, and therefore which rooms require light and fire. An unclear message causes the powerhouse to answer the wrong problem. The house is not attacking you. It is continuing to operate according to relationships you have failed to see. Physical exhaustion now becomes part of judgment. As the shift lengthens, the simple jobs become harder to order. You carry what the lift should have raised. You repeat a route because the first load was wrong. You relight a fire that was allowed to sink. Coal does not have to reach the Hayden Bridge extreme of minus 23.3 degrees Celsius to make delay consequential. That documented reading belongs to another place in Northumberland and cannot be assigned to Cragside. It establishes only a bounded regional fact. Severe winter weather was possible, so lost warmth was not trivial. Would you die before midnight? The evidence cannot say that, and the documentary will not pretend it can. Would you continue maintaining the house safely and effectively through the winter? No, not without instruction, an experienced team, and time to acquire the knowledge they carried. You would fail the role through accumulated misallocation, missed maintenance, late delivery, and physical fatigue. That is the genuine ordeal. Lord Armstrong's smart home does not contain one secret Victorian killer. It contains many systems that work well only when people join them at the correct moments. Your problem is not that every machine breaks. Your problem is that most of them can remain functional while the household result falls apart around you. There is one objection left, and it is the most important. Victorian people did survive winters at Cragside. They kept the house operating, lived long working lives, learned new gear, and adapted as Lord Armstrong's experiments changed. If they survived, how can the title honestly say that you would not? Because the you in this documentary has never meant an average person born into that world. It means an untrained modern novice, arriving with modern assumptions and without the household's tacit knowledge. The difference is not courage, it is preparation. Walter Mavin carried the title Caretaker of Electric Light because care of the system was a recognized duty. Andrew Crozier used the telephone because the butler's knowledge of occupied rooms had to reach the powerhouse. Other servants cleaned grates, tended fires, moved fuel, carried water, prepared food, answered signals, and fitted their work around a household schedule. Where Cragside's exact roster is incomplete, their names must remain unknown. Their competence does not become less real because the record is uneven. Now count the things you would have to learn. You must distinguish electric light from winter heat. You must understand that the whole house cannot be lit at once, and that current follows a communicated decision. You must learn what the butler knows about occupancy and what the caretaker knows about supply. You must recognize the manual contact of an adapted lamp and the changing carbon gap of an arc light. You must know that troublesome lamps are documented without treating every dark room as the same defect. You must follow water through the estate without assuming that every use shares one immediate route. Water stored and directed in the landscape can power generating gear, a hydraulic lift, or a kitchen mill. Each machine converts that force into a different service. Presence of water is not yet useful pressure, rotation, or current. You must keep the heating chains separate. A basement boiler warms pipes beneath the Turkish bath floor. Fireplaces still require fuel and care. A 6-meter hearth can dominate a room and still cool when its grate is neglected. The jigger raises coal about 9 meters, but does not carry it from the lift to the fire. If the route is unavailable, the weight returns to bodies and stairs. You must learn the rhythm around those machines. A period manual can prescribe rising at 6:30 in winter and repeated rounds of grate, fire, hot water, coal, and woodwork. It cannot tell you Cragside's exact local order. That order lives in the worker's practice. The time between one task and the next is knowledge. You must interpret signals. A telephone call, dinner gong, and fire alarm move different kinds of instruction. Hearing them is not enough. The correct response depends on role, timing, and context. Finally, you must understand that the house changes. The 1870 heat system, 1878 arc light, 1880 incandescent lamps, 1884 lamp trouble, and generating changes around 1886 are not a collection of dates for a museum label. They are the history of problems encountered and answers added. The mature house assumes knowledge of that accumulation. No modern visitor could be expected to possess all of this on arrival. That is not an insult. Put a Victorian servant in front of an unfamiliar modern control room without instruction, and the unfairness would run in the other direction. Human beings survive complex systems by learning them in communities, not by inheriting universal technical instinct. The word servant can make that learning disappear because it describes a position more readily than a body of knowledge. At Cragside, service includes reading rooms, gear, people, and time. Some knowledge is formal enough to appear in a manual. Some is technical enough to belong to a caretaker. Some is social enough to belong to a butler. Much of it is practical enough to pass from worker to worker without entering the records that survive. The missing paper trail is not proof of missing skill. This is also why one heroic protagonist would be false to the house. Armstrong initiates the experiments. Walter carries electrical duty. Crozier connects household demand to the powerhouse. Indoor staff make warmth, water, food, and rooms arrive in usable order. The ordeal is held by several people. because no one person possesses every part of the answer. So the answer is direct. No, you would not survive winter in Lord Armstrong's smart home as the person responsible for keeping it running. You would not maintain its expected heat, light, food, water, timing, and safety across the season. The failure would begin in small choices and grow through exhaustion and delay until skilled people had to rescue the household from your service. The Victorians who did survive are the evidence for this verdict, not evidence against it. They succeeded because they were not solitary contestants dropped into a hostile age. They were workers inside a team, carrying knowledge between departments and from one day to the next. Their routines stored the operating memory that walls and machines could not. Lord Armstrong's designs deserve their fame. The people who made those designs domestic deserve equal place in the story. Without them, Cragside is an extraordinary set of tools waiting for instructions. With them, it becomes a house that can answer winter. Return to the butler's telephone. At the beginning, it seemed like one more marvel in a house of marvels. By the end, it has become the clearest object in the story. It cannot generate current. It cannot choose an occupied room. It cannot regulate a carbon gap, inspect a troublesome lamp, raise coal, heat a pipe, turn a roast, clean a grate, or carry hot water. What it can do is connect two people who each know something the other needs. Andrew Crozier's side of the link holds the living map of the household. Rooms open and close around family, guests, meals, and evening plans. The need for light begins in that changing social world. Walter Mavin's side holds duty for experimental generating technology. The answer depends on what the electrical system can provide. The call joins need to available power. That relationship repeats everywhere in Cragside. The lake holds water, but engineering gives the water a route. The jigger raises a load, but servants give the load a destination. The barker's mill turns the spit, but the kitchen gives the turning a meal. Central heating moves warmth, but household knowledge decides which additional fires need care. A lamp produces light, but a hand, a message, and a caretaker keep light attached to use. Lord Armstrong's genius was to see force waiting in the landscape and imagine what it could do inside a house. Margaret Armstrong helped shape the home and grounds in which those experiments became lived experience. The result was neither an illusion nor a fully automated future. It was a remarkable Victorian household whose machines extended what people could do. Winter makes the extension visible because winter does not allow many results to be postponed. Heat is useful while a room is occupied. Hot water is useful while it remains hot. Food is useful when the household is prepared to eat. Light is useful where people have gathered. Coal is useful after it reaches the grate. A message is useful before the wrong decision consumes the available time. You would arrive knowing the names of many technologies. The people at Cragside knew their order. That is the gap the entire documentary has measured. The house began in 1863 as a lodge and grew across decades. Central heating arrived with the 1870 expansion. Water-powered arc light appeared in 1878. Swan lamps entered the library in 1880. A January 1881 explanation preserves the strange manual Mercury contact. Correspondence in 1884 preserves lamp trouble. A generating setup nearer the house followed around 1886 as rising demand exposed the inefficiency of the more distant system. Every date added a new tool, and every tool required someone to absorb new knowledge into the household day. The surviving record does not give us one complete winter shift. It does not let us place Crozier and Mavin in a single, precisely dated conversation. It does not prove a Cragside blackout, frozen reservoir, burst pipe, poisoning, injury, or death. That absence does not empty the story. It prevents us from replacing the real operating problem with a false catastrophe. The real problem is quieter. A great house can contain advanced machinery and remain dependent on care at every boundary. Water must become pressure. Pressure must become movement. Current must become useful light. Fuel must become sustained heat. Signals must become action. Each conversion is possible. None is automatic simply because the house is famous. This is why the title belongs to Lord Armstrong's particular home, rather than to a generic Victorian winter. Cragside has its own people, its own routes, its own experimental chronology, and its own documented troubles. Another mansion would test you differently. This one defeats you through teamwork. The handset can now return to its place. At one end stands the person who knows what the household wants. At the other stands the person who knows what the power system can do. Between them runs a wire through a house that has often been called smart. The smartest thing in that link is still the knowledge carried by the people.